Hello, everyone, and welcome to TEFL's Masterclass. My name is David Byrne, and today we're talking about managing differentiation in the age of AI. Today, we're going to talk about differentiation. We're going to start by defining differentiation, and we're going to talk about its impact on learners. We'll make the case for open communication around abilities, and then discuss a framework for managing this open communication. We'll also suggest some strategies for sort of varying the tasks within the lesson. And all of this is so that you can manage differentiation openly in your classroom. Now, the title of this talk is Managing Differentiation in the Age of AI. And you'll notice that I don't mention AI in any of these aims. And that's because AI is so quickly becoming just part of everything we do, and it's just going to more so become a part of everyday lessons, that we're going to talk about it throughout the talk and again in the discussion later on. So what do we mean by differentiation? Well, for me, there's a number of different aspects. There's mixed levels, of course. And I think more and more these days, we're seeing mixed levels as something we have to face in our classrooms. I've personally noticed just fewer and fewer beginner students coming into our schools. So when we do get beginners, of course, they're merged in with elementary students. And this is in some ways great. It's the success of the industry. There's fewer and fewer people who are absolute A0s. But we're also seeing some classes where maybe we're looking at merging across 2 or 3 or even 4 different levels. And this can be quite challenging for a teacher. Even within the most homogenous class with, all intermediate students, for example, even then, there's still going to be a lot of differentiation because all of those students have spiky profiles. They got strengths and weaknesses, great grammar, great vocabulary, very confident speaking, maybe not great at writing. All of us in everything we do have different strengths and weaknesses. So spiky profiles, even in the most normal intermediate, upper intermediate class, we're still seeing this differentiation. For me, there's another aspect as well, which I think is super important, which is needs and interests. I think more and more we're understanding that we really need to be catering to our students' needs and interests. Why are they studying English? And how are we meeting those needs? There's also neurodiversity, which, because of the scope and time of today's workshop, we're not really going to dig into, but I do think it's a really interesting area of differentiation that we do need to cater for and manage in our classes. Now, differentiation is nothing new. We've managed differentiation for years and years and years. But maybe how we manage it is changing. And one of the reasons for this is the rise of AI. More and more, we're seeing AI tools that can personalize the input and practice that students are getting. And this is absolutely fantastic. It's wonderful. And if used correctly, we can really personalize everything we do in the classroom to our students, which is really what we want to do. Now, the worry is always, does this mean there won't be a teacher or there won't be any need for a teacher? I really don't think this is the case. What I do predict is that in the future, students will spend a portion of every lesson on a device using AI to get activities that are personalized to them, to their needs, their interests, and to their level. And I think that's a great thing. That doesn't mean there's no teacher. That doesn't mean it's for the entire lesson, or that all of the lesson will be done outside class on a device, or that everything will become online learning. It just means that we're allowing for differentiation within the class. It's already happening in some schools. There's tools appearing all the time that are doing this in various ways. And I really do think that in the future, we will see this happening more and more. But we're not all there just yet. Not every school around the world has the resources for students to be doing this. And this is absolutely fine. In the meantime, we're still going to be managing differentiation ourselves. And what I want to look at today is kind of setting the stage for that future and starting to managing it now effectively. So how do we do that? Well, before we think about that, let's think about what happens if we ignore differentiation in the classroom. So the reality is, if we ignore it, students don't. Students are they're astute. They're always looking around the class, looking at their classmates, and they're assessing them. They're thinking, well, that person's really, really great at English. They're just wonderful. And maybe they're making that assumption based on the student's fluency and confidence, and maybe not on all the factors that we might base an assessment on, their range of lexis, their risk-taking, their accuracy. Maybe that student is purely just a very confident speaker, and they actually have a lot of weaknesses and areas to work on. And maybe the student who's assessing them themselves has a lot of strengths, but isn't as confident a speaker. And so they're starting to assess each other's levels, but without all of the frameworks and structure that we would maybe use to assess levels. So ignoring it ourselves doesn't mean it's not happening. If you have a class in front of you with 3 merged levels, those students are aware. They can see someone is very, very strong and someone else is not able to do the material or the activities in the same way. So we can't really ignore it, because if they're not, what is the result of that? What is that going to lead to? Well, I think, put simply, it's going to lead to frustration. Frustration at the maybe lower end that they can't do what someone else can do, and maybe frustration at the higher end that sometimes there's information in the lesson that they already know, they've already covered, that is far too easy for them. And this frustration invariably leads to disengagement. And it's all understandable. So we can't ignore it. But I get a lot of teachers saying things like, oh, I've got, 3 different levels in the class, so that means I need to create 3 different lessons and, triple my planning time, and I need to be running around the class giving input in 3 different groups. And I really don't think that makes sense. I really don't think that should be how we do it. It's a lot to ask of a teacher. It's just far too much. So we need to think of other ways we can manage it. Before we dig into that, I want to tell you 2 stories. And your task is to listen to the stories and think, what do they have in common? And you can write in the chat window if you like. You can write anything interesting that jumps out at you from the stories as we go, and we can dig into it later. So the 2 stories. The first story is a long time ago when I was managing a school, and a teacher had just taught an advanced class. And they left their class, and unfortunately, another teacher had last minute had to go home sick. So we had a class without a teacher, and luckily, this teacher who just finished the advanced class knew these students. She had taught them before. So we asked her literally 10 minutes, would you be able to cover this class? Now, we know it's not ideal. We also know it happens in schools sometimes. So she very kindly said, yes, I will do it. I've just taught an advanced class, have some material. I think I can use it with the upper intermediate class. Great. Off she went. She began her lesson by explaining that she had some advanced material for them to do today, some advanced language, grammar, everything, and advanced reading text. And she was going to do it with them because she believed they were up to the challenge. But she also mentioned that she didn't expect them to understand absolutely everything in the text. She expected that to be quite a stretch for them and to not worry. And also that she didn't expect them to be able to use all of the language by the end of the lesson, and that it was okay for them to choose some of the language along the way that was comfortable for them to use at the end of the lesson. Now, what was wonderful was how immediately engaged the students were. When she reported back to me later on, she said they were even more engaged than usual, that they understood that it was above them, and that when they hit things that they didn't maybe understand or weren't able to grasp or use immediately, it didn't faze them. They understood and they took what they could from it, and they were engaged throughout the whole lesson. And it was really great to see. And I'm sure many of you have had experiences like that as well. The second story was a lesson I observed a few years ago. It was an English for Work lesson. And this teacher, he was a great teacher, he had a real spread of students in that class, like different levels, but also in an English for Work class, real different needs. We had a CEO in the class, we had a nurse in the class, we had an accountant, and just different levels within the organization, some starting out in their career, some quite far in their career, real spread. And he began the class and he explained the objective, said, we're all going to do this. We're all going to achieve this objective. But some of the things we're going to learn to do it, some will be interesting for you. This is going to be really useful for this student. This is going to be really useful for these guys. This is going to be really useful for you guys. And you might not use this vocabulary too much, but you're going to use this. And he started the class with this open discussion about which parts of the lesson were going to be more interesting, more necessary, more relevant, I suppose, for each of the students in the class. And what happened was he carried it on throughout the lesson. And all of the students, they sort of ebbed and flowed in terms of their total engagement. They were all engaged throughout because they understood the importance of the lesson. But there was also an understanding there were points where they had to really focus. There were points where they had to stretch themselves, and maybe points where they didn't have to stretch themselves as much. And what I loved about it was just this open acknowledgement that we're not all going to pay 100% of attention for 90 minutes for the whole time. Hopefully, you're paying 100% attention for the next 90 minutes, but we'll all ebb and flow in our engagement and our attention. So those are my two stories. So in the chat window, start thinking about what they kind of have in common, and I'll tell you what sort of the bits that I picked out were. For me, in both stories, the teachers took an open approach to differentiation. They didn't ignore it, they didn't hide it, they accepted it, and they discussed it with their students. From the very beginning of the lesson, I think this is huge, students are making decisions, making assumptions at the very beginning of a lesson. And if we don't manage expectations and get them at that point, we're going to have to work so hard to bring them back from disengagement. So expectations were managed from the very beginning. And because of these two things, students were motivated and engaged throughout. So today I want to kind of look at a few steps we can take in class to set the stage for this type of motivation and engagement, to create this open, dialogic approach to differentiation. So for me, step one is very, very simple, right? An objective approach. When I say objective, I don't mean objective subjective. I'm thinking, where are we going? Goals. So for me, it's so important that we know why our students are studying English. And it might seem so simple, but with continuous enrollment and everything like that, it can be something that we sort of forget or take for granted. Now, I'm always a fan of going below the surface, right? Because so often I'm studying English so that I can get a job, attend university, or travel the world. And that's, mostly that's why I hear people saying they're studying English. For me, I want to dig a bit deeper, right? Because if we even just attend university, depending on the student, well, they might need to be able to give presentations, take notes, write essays, chat socially. And I had a student not so long ago, they were attending sort of a University of the Arts. And so actually, they didn't need to really write essays at all. And we tend to think, oh, you're going to university? Great, IELTS, I'll prep you for this, blah, blah, blah. They didn't need that at all. What they did need was pitches, poster presentation, being able to describe art, design, vocabulary, everything like that. So it was really interesting. Chat socially, of course. So it was really interesting that once we dug into their needs, it became clear it was maybe not as clear as we thought. So if we know what students need to learn, we're better able to manage that differentiation and just manage that motivation and interest. And we do that with step two. Step 2 is taking an objective approach to every lesson. Right? Now, again, this might seem super simple. It's very common and sort of accepted these days that every lesson has an objective, has an outcome. But very often when I look at the outcomes, when people talk about outcomes, they are written in a way that doesn't leave room for differentiation. So they might be written in a way that contains the language they're going to learn in the lesson. It might mention the present perfect, or it might mention a range of tenses, or these kinds of outcomes. And I think they're limiting us. And so I would say we should move to more open, real life objectives. Tell a story. Share your opinions, talk about your hobbies, talk about your interests, debate a topic. Any student, whether they are beginner or advanced, can tell a story. They just get there in a different way. Now, by having these real life communicative objectives, and realistically, if you look at any course book these days, it is all moving towards some real life objective of sorts. We just need to make sure it's worded in a way that allows us to manage that discussion across the lesson. So if we take this idea of tell a story. So for me, every lesson begins with, today we are going to tell a story, right? Students all know by the end of the lesson, this is where they're going. From the very beginning, I have everybody on board because everybody is going to achieve the same goal. They might get there in different ways, but they're going to achieve the same goal. So my conversation sort of revolves around, when do you need to tell stories in your life? How does this help you with your own objective? And why do I ask these questions? Because I want to manage the differentiation of interests and needs. To keep with this idea, if I say tell a story, you might have students who need English for work, for the workplace, thinking, I don't write stories, I don't tell stories, I don't need this is not for me, come on. But the reality is, all day long in work, we tell stories, we talk about projects, we talk about meetings we went to, we talk about conferences, we talk about videos we saw, whatever it is, we're telling stories. Super important. So what we need to do at the beginning is manage the differentiation of interest and needs across the class by helping students to see how the objective is relevant for them. And again, it's managing those expectations from the outset. Students are looking at this and they are making decisions in their head about whether or not it's relevant for them. We cannot ignore it. If we open it up, we get to actually have a dialogue with them. We get to change their minds. We get to help them to see the relevance. If we don't, we're leaving it up to them to be engaged or disengaged with the lesson. So it's really important that we're talking about these things. The next sort of layer for me is, what language do you already have to tell stories, for example, about your weekends or whatever the context is? Now, this starts a conversation about managing differentiation of level, of language level, because students are talking about what they've already bringing to the class. It's an open conversation, and it will feed into the next step. So once we know what we're going to do, we have to make sure we're carrying on this throughout the lesson, with each activity building towards this. So I'll always word it with aims as well as an objective. Today we're going to learn 5 to 10 new weekend activities, learn to tell a story using past simple, using past continuous, using linking words, whatever way you are getting there for your class and your different levels. Now, you'll notice this lovely picture here, and you might say, this is just a single road that cars or tractors have driven down for so long that they've worried in these grooves in the path. But what I see is 2 paths heading in the same direction, but getting there in different ways. And that is how I like to think about my classes and about managing differentiation. We're all going to tell a story by the end of the lesson. but we're going to get there in different ways. My favorite thing when having this discussion with students is to think about comfort zones, right? So very, very simple: comfort, stretch, and red. So for each of these aims, I want students thinking, which one do I feel is my comfort zone? Which one am I already bringing in? We've started that conversation with, what language do you already have to talk about or to tell stories? So we started that conversation. Now they're thinking, okay, past simple, that's my comfort zone. For me, the past continuous is going to be my stretch zone today. Some others might be going weekend activities, new vocabulary, and past simple. That's my stretch zone. That's as much as I'm going to be able to do. But this past continuous, that's maybe going to be a bit too far. Let's see when we get there. So we have this open conversation. What your students are telling you is, what do I need to learn and what do I need feedback on? You're having this conversation around the class, and because it's open for everybody, they all know expectations are managed from the very beginning. And as I said, this carries on throughout. In the sort of this future world that we live in of AI, you can be looking at these stages. Some of these stages are the ones that I expect become the more personalized learning, where students are working away on their stretch goals, and maybe some of them doing weekend activities and past simple, but whatever it is at their level. And these tools are out there. There's a lot of really interesting ones. There's a lot of schools that are doing this already, not necessarily EFL schools, but there's the 2-hour learning program in the US, where students spend 2 hours a day working on the more academic subjects with personalized AI tools, and then spend the other parts of the day collaborating and working together on more sort of 21st century or soft skills or whatever. So these things are growing, and they're on the horizon. Later on, we'll look at how to use the current AI tools, the current free ones we have, to maybe manage differentiation of task as well. But even in our classes without AI, we can be having this conversation with our students so they know, much like the English for Work class, when is my time to really pay attention, and when is the time when it's less important for me, it's going to be a bit stressful for me, and I can know that I can expect this to be a little bit stressful, so I can manage that myself. It helps us to manage that anxiety of our students as well. So we've had this conversation across our lesson, and what this does is set the stage for personalized feedback. Because at the end of the lesson, when we finally say, now we're going to tell stories about our weekend or whatever it is we're telling stories about, we have a simple question for our students. What language and skills from the lesson are you each going to practice? And because they've had this conversation across the whole lesson, because they know where their comfort zones and stretch zones are, they're now making decisions. I'm going to practice these. Someone else is going to practice 3. I'm going to practice these 2. We all know going in. They're telling you what feedback they need, what they want to hear from their peers, what they want to hear from you as a teacher. And this is a really beautiful scenario when students are making decisions about how they're going to achieve your lesson objective. It's not if, it's how they're going to achieve it. And much simpler for those students to then reflect, self-assess, and go, do you know what? I did use 3 or 4 new pieces of vocabulary. I did use the past simple. I think now, using past continuous, I think I can stretch to that. And you get this lovely situation where students are sort of +1ing themselves. And I think it's often a concern kind of, but won't students keep to the comfort zone and not stretch themselves? And I'll be honest, I've really never seen that. I've never encountered that. Students tend to go, let me at least, take that +1 step. But that again is where we come in as motivators, as facilitators of learning, sort of mentioning to students, hey, actually, I hear you at this point of the lesson using all of this past simple. I think actually past continuous is a reality for you. It's a possibility. So even though you said at the beginning it was going to be too much of a stretch, how would you feel about trying it? And we have this beautiful conversation throughout. You also get peers, obviously more aware of each other's strengths and weaknesses, discussing it together and saying, you did do that. Actually, you could maybe do this. So we have these beautiful dialogues going across the class. If we follow these sort of 4 steps and apply this framework, what we get for me is successful differentiation. And I define that as students all working towards the same goal. And I can't stress this enough. This has to be what we're trying to do. We all achieve it in our own way. They achieve success in a manner that is appropriate for themselves. This can even be, again, to talk about managing differentiation of sort of interests. If we're telling stories, maybe it's not about telling stories about the weekend. Maybe one person is telling a story of something project at work, and someone else is telling a story of a night out, and someone else is telling a story of funny incident. But we're sort of allowing them to achieve it in a manner appropriate for themselves. The key one, the absolute key, and the one that I think sort of removes the disengagement and the frustration that I spoke about at the beginning, is that they receive feedback appropriate to their level. If a student feels they are learning and they are getting feedback at their level, it kind of doesn't matter if they're in a mixed group, because they're pushing forward. What we want is a situation in which students are comparing themselves to themselves as opposed to themselves to others. So they're seeing their progress, and they know that they're making progress on their own terms. So as long as we've had that conversation throughout the class and we're finishing with students getting peer feedback, getting feedback from their teacher, and self-assessing at their level, we're achieving that goal. And the final one is they can openly discuss their goal and success of their goal. And I think that's just so important, just being able to go, this is where we were going. This helped me with my goal in this way. I'm engaged. This is progress. And when you have those conversations with students, you see how motivated and how engaged they are. They're beautiful, beautiful conversations to have. So for me, this framework is something that I do think, as we go on, AI is going to help support us even more and make our role even easier so that we can just really support our students and facilitate their learning. But what about now? What about the kind of resources we have now? So I've sort of setting up this framework is great, but we still have the material that maybe institutionally we have to teach. And managing differentiation with that can be just that bit more challenging. And I think that's why some teachers say, I need to plan 3 lessons and everything like that. And I do understand it. But what I think we're going to talk about today is sort of keeping this idea of comfort zone and stretch and just applying it to different tasks in material. So we'll look at some common task types. So what about reading? Well, if we take a reading text, now every reading exercise is followed by this comprehension task. And it's always kind of the same, isn't it? It's the gist task and then the more detailed task. Now, for me, this kind of feels like in a class with, various levels within it, we might be setting them up to fail. Is it really fair for them to have different levels of comprehension? One person's getting 7 out of 10, another person's getting 3 out of 10, and, okay, let's move on. It doesn't seem like the best way to manage differentiation when it comes to reading. For me, I like to bring in more real life comprehension checking questions. So things like, what did you find interesting? What do you want to know more about? And the reason is it leads to a real conversation that will reveal their comprehension and add to their comprehension of the text. And that's what we want, really, isn't it? We want them to develop their comprehension, not just to test it and see how well they did. So I love this because maybe those with like stronger reading skills in the class have an opportunity to summarize, to help people see below the surface. Those who maybe just saw this, got the surface level of comprehension, are helped to understand deeper meaning. And in the end, that's how we operate in the real world, isn't it? We read something, maybe we don't have all of the background information to grasp it entirely, but we have someone who does. They fill us in on the background, they fill us in on the deeper meaning. Maybe we missed something. They mediate the text for us, they mediate the meaning. So setting up these more real life tasks when it comes to comprehension, I think really helps to manage differentiation of levels. But there is situations. Now, I was teaching in Korea and I had a class of 11-year-olds, and therefore they were upper intermediate. But the reality was they weren't upper intermediate. There was a beginner in the class, there was an advanced in the class, and kind of everything in between. And this poor beginner student, I was a much less experienced teacher, and I just didn't really have the tools to support him, to know how best to support him. And the material was clearly upper intermediate, and he was so disengaged, so demotivated. And I think back on that a lot, because these days we do have the tools. Now, this is something I use a lot. Gemini, which is an AI tool. It's free. You can get the app on your phone. It's similar to ChatGPT. You can also get that. What I do is click this little button down here, the little camera, take a photo of the text and say, could you simplify this text for a beginner learner of English? And boom, like that, you have a simplified text. Now, you can really play with that prompt to get a text that is really worthwhile. So you can say, let's say the grammar in the lesson is present continuous, and maybe there's 10 items of lexis that the students at this level are expected to learn from the text. You can say, please include an example of the present continuous, and please include 5 of these words. And that will now be in the text. So students can still follow along towards the objective, still using the text they have in front of them to analyze the present continuous, still use the text to learn 5 items of vocabulary relevant to the lesson. So they're still moving towards the same objective, but again, they're taking a slightly different, more appropriate, more relevant path for them to get there. So I really, really like this. You can also ask it to simplify concepts. Maybe if there's a concept that is tricky for the students, you can just take a photo and say, please explain this concept in Spanish or French, whatever. All of this is possible, and it just gives that student a little step up so they can carry on with the lesson. And it's just fantastic. It's so quick and easy to use. So simplify text or to explain tricky concepts. I also like to have it with listening as well. So listening is one that everyone really struggles with. I know listening in other languages, it can just be so demotivating when you kind of don't understand everything. So I like to really incorporate this idea of comfort, stretch, and maybe stress zones. And it's simple. I sort of give options as to how students want to do it. Do you want to go ahead and do the exercise as the book suggests? So just beginning, press play, do the listening comprehension tasks, whatever is in the book. And maybe the ones who are 100% at that level or above, yeah, this is going to stretch me a little bit. This is good for me. I don't expect to get it everything, but I'm gonna get enough. I can do this. Maybe other ones, the choice is to listen with the transcript or with subtitles, depending on what it is. Maybe these days, with a lot of ebooks being available and students having access to materials beforehand, you can even say, why don't you guys listen to this a few times before the lesson? Is that your choice? You can give students ownership of how many times they listen to it. Again, it's not going to be possible in every context, but in some it will be. If they have access to the book on their phones and they have earphones, they can listen to it, stop it, listen to it at their own speed. We can sort of manage differentiation by allowing students to choose. And again, This, I feel, is where we're going with students choosing how they learn and AI feeding them things. We can begin that process, especially with listening tasks, I think. Same with reading. You could use this concept with reading and say, do you want to stay in the comfort zone of just doing gist, or do you want to do the gist comprehension and the detailed comprehension that's more in maybe a stretch zone? And depending on their level, they might choose both or one, and that's absolutely fine. And you can follow that up then with the real life comprehension discussion. It's the same for me with kind of with grammar. I like to do back in the days, call it the early finishers things, like always have something for early finishers. But I think these days, just being open and saying it's okay to get through as many of these things as you want. So keeping this lesson we were talking about earlier of telling a story. So we've got maybe past simple, maybe there's past continuous, maybe there's an example of past perfect in there to really stretch those in the class who are at the higher level. Now, all of these three activities are possible in the time we have, depending on your level. You guys do as many as you can in this time. It's absolutely fine if you don't finish them all. Those who want the stretch are going to push themselves to finish all three. Those others are maybe just going to use the time they have to achieve what is possible for them. So as long as we're moving towards the same objective, those aims in the middle, I think those are variable, those are movable. We can help students to decide which of them they're going to follow. And it doesn't mean planning a whole new lesson. It just means being open to students not achieving or completing everything within the class and still moving towards that final goal. There's many different strengths and weaknesses in all of our lessons. And this is absolutely fantastic. It's not a bad thing. It's just people moving in the same direction at different speeds. And I think we should sort of embrace it. We should use AI tools to support us, and we should set the stage for open dialogue so that in the future, students can be using AI tools for those times in the class to be getting that personalized attention.